September 13, 1982. A winding mountain road high above Monaco. A car, a 1972 Rover, snaking along the same treacherous hairpin turns that had appeared in one of her most famous films. Inside, a mother and daughter. Outside, the steep Mediterranean cliffs dropping away into nothing. Within moments, the car would plunge over the edge, tumbling 120 foot down the mountainside. The woman behind the wheel was 52 years old. She had been Hollywood royalty before she became actual royalty. She had walked away from everything from Oscar glory and the brightest spotlight in the world to marry a prince and live in a palace. Her name was Grace Kelly. And the fairy tale that America had fallen in love with was about to end in the most brutal way imaginable. This is the story of how a Philadelphia girl became a princess and how that dream slowly transformed into something darker than anyone could have predicted. The Philadelphia Dream. Grace Patricia Kelly was born on November 12, 1929 in Philadelphia to a family that had everything except acceptance by the old money elite. Her father, John B. Kelly, was a self-made millionaire who had built the most successful brick business on the East Coast. But more than that, he was a legend. He'd won 3 Olympic gold medals for rowing, a feat that made him a hero to working-class Americans everywhere. But Philadelphia society never quite forgot that Jack Kelly had started as a bricklayer. Music. They never let him into their exclusive clubs. When he ran for mayor, he lost by the narrowest margin in the city's history. The rejection stung, and it shaped how he raised his children. He wanted them to succeed to prove that the Kellys belonged at the top. Grace was the third of 4 children. And from the start, she was different. Her older siblings were athletic, boisterous, natural extensions of their father's competitive spirit. Grace was quiet, delicate, almost ethereal. Her father once said that of his 4 children, she was the one he'd least expect to support him in his old age. It wasn't meant kindly. She found her escape in acting. At 12, she played the lead in a community theater production. She loved the transformation, the way she could become someone else under the lights. Her family thought it was cute, a phase she'd outgrow. Her father thought acting was barely respectable, just a step above being a streetwalker. But Grace knew what she wanted. After graduating from Stevens School in 1947, she announced she was moving to New York to become an actress. Her parents tried to stop her, but Grace had inherited her father's stubborn determination. She enrolled at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts and worked as a model to pay her tuition. She posed for cigarette advertisements and bug spray commercials, whatever paid the bills. At the Academy, she struggled. Her voice was thin, unable to project properly in the theater. Teachers told her she'd never make it on stage. But television was just emerging, and Grace found her medium. She appeared in dozens of live television dramas, learning her craft in front of millions of viewers during what would later be called the Golden Age of television. In 1949, she made her Broadway debut in The Father by August Strindberg alongside Raymond Massey. Critics barely noticed her, but Grace kept working, kept pushing, kept believing that Hollywood would eventually come calling. In 1951, it did. Hollywood's Ice Queen. Grace Kelly arrived in Hollywood at 22, and she was nothing like the other starlets. In an era of sultry brunettes and bombshells like Marilyn Monroe and Ava Gardner, Grace was cool, elegant, almost untouchable. She had blonde hair swept into a perfect shiny, wore white gloves, and carried herself with a reserve that drove men wild precisely because it seemed unattainable. The press called her the girl in white gloves. Magazines noted her prim appearance, her ladylike demeanor, the way she seemed to float through Hollywood parties without ever quite being part of them. Her first film, 14 Hours in 1951, gave her barely any screen time. She played a small role, hardly memorable, just another pretty face in a crowd scene. But the following year, she landed a role opposite Gary Cooper in High Noon, playing a Quaker bride who stands by her martial husband despite her pacifist beliefs. The film was a massive hit and suddenly Grace Kelly was someone Hollywood noticed. Cooper, one of the biggest stars in the world, had genuine chemistry with this newcomer and audiences responded. Then came Mambo in 1953 where she starred opposite Clark Gable and Ava Gardner in an African adventure filmed on location in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. Director John Ford pushed her hard, but Grace held her own against two of Hollywood's most powerful personalities. She played a proper English wife opposite Gardner's sultry showgirl, and the contrast made both performances shine. The role earned her an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actress and a Golden Globe win. At 24, she was on her way to becoming a genuine star. More importantly, she'd proven she could hold the screen against legendary actors and not be overshadowed. But it was Alfred Hitchcock who truly understood what Grace Kelly could do. He saw past the cool exterior to the complexity beneath. Hitchcock was fascinated by the contradiction Grace embodied, a woman who looked like she belonged in a museum, but suggested depths of passion and danger just beneath the surface. He cast her in Dial M for Murder in 1954, a thriller about a woman whose husband tries to have her killed. Grace played the role with intelligence and nuance, making the audience care deeply about her survival. Then came Rear Window later that same year, and this was the film that cemented Grace's place in cinema history. Opposite James Stewart, she played Lisa Fremont, a fashion magazine editor in love with a photographer who's more interested in his camera than in her. Grace wore stunning costumes designed by Edith Head, each outfit a masterpiece. She moved through the frame like a dream, but she also brought humor and warmth to the role. The scene where she models different outfits for Stewart's immobilized photographer is one of the most famous sequences in Hitchcock's entire catalog. The film became one of his acknowledged masterpieces, and Grace's performance was at its heart, proving she could be more than just beautiful. She could be funny, vulnerable, and captivating all at once. Hitchcock was obsessed with her. He later spent years trying to find another actress who could replicate what Grace brought to the screen, casting blonde after blonde in his films, but never quite capturing that same magic. Grace was his perfect muse, the embodiment of everything he wanted in a leading lady. Beauty, sophistication, and the hint of something dangerous beneath the polished surface. That same year, 1954, Grace made The Country Girl with Bing Crosby. And this was the role that would define her as a serious actress. She shed all her glamour to play Georgie Elgin, the worn-down, exhausted wife of an alcoholic singer trying to make a comeback. Grace wore no makeup, dressed in doughy clothes, and stripped away every trace of the elegance she was known for. Hollywood couldn't believe the transformation. This was Grace Kelly, the ice music queen, looking plain and beaten down and making audiences believe every moment of it. At the Academy Awards in 1955, Grace Kelly won the Oscar for Best Actress, beating out Judy Garland's heavily favored performance in A Star Is Born. She was 25 years old and at the absolute peak of her career. The girl from Philadelphia, who'd been told her voice wasn't strong enough for theater, music, had just won the highest honor in film. One more Hitchcock film followed in 1955, To Catch a Thief, filmed on the French Riviera with Cary Grant. The two had instant chemistry, and the film sparkled with their wit and elegant banter. They played a game of sophisticated flirtation throughout the movie. Grant as a reformed jewel thief and Grace as a wealthy heiress who may or may not trust him. The location shooting along the Mediterranean coast was stunning and Grace looked luminous in every frame. Years later, when asked to name his favorite co-star, Grant would answer without hesitation, Grace Kelly. He said she had serenity, a quality he found rare and precious in the frantic world of Hollywood. By 1956, Grace had made two more films, The Swan, where she played a princess being groomed to marry royalty, a role that would prove eerily prophetic, and High Society, a musical remake of the Philadelphia Story with Bing Crosby, music, and Frank Sinatra. Her rendition of True Love with Crosby became so popular it earned her a gold record. She was at the height of her fame. Beautiful, talented, beloved by audiences around the world. Critics praised her versatility, moving from Hitchcock thrillers to dramas to musicals without missing a beat. She'd made 11 films in just 5 years, an astonishing output that showcased her range and dedication. But Grace Kelly hated Hollywood. She found it shallow, cruel, a place without pity. She was grossly underpaid compared to her male co-stars, receiving a mere $5,000 for To Catch a Thief, while Cary Grant was paid $18,000. She'd been paid only $750 a week for Mambo, while Clark Gable received $5,000. The inequality enraged her, but the studio system was unbreakable. She had no leverage, no power to demand better. The press sounded her constantly, spreading rumors about her relationships with her leading men. Cooper, Gable, Ray Milland, Clark Gable again, William Holden. Every co-star became fodder for gossip. Every aspect of her private life was scrutinized, twisted, packaged for public consumption. She was treated as property by MGM Studios, which controlled her contract and told her which films she'd make and which she wouldn't. Years later, Grace would say that Hollywood amused her, that it was holier than thou for the public and unholier than the devil in reality. She saw the hypocrisy, the way the industry preached morality while practicing exploitation. She was tired of it all by 1955, burned out at 26, looking for an escape route from a world that had given her everything and taken just as much. So when she traveled to the Cannes Film Festival in May 1955 to promote Music, To Catch a Thief, and a Paris match photographer arranged for her to meet the Prince of Monaco for a photo session, Grace saw it as just another publicity obligation. She had no idea that meeting would change everything. The Prince and the Escape. Prince Rainier III of Monaco was 32 years old when he met Grace Kelly. He'd been ruling the tiny principality since 1949, Music inheriting a country that was essentially bankrupt. Tourism had dried up. The famous Monte Carlo casino was struggling. Monaco needed something to bring it back to life. And Rainier's advisors had a suggestion. Marry someone famous. Specifically, marry a Hollywood star. The idea wasn't entirely mercenary. Under the terms of a treaty with France, if Rainier died without an heir, Monaco would be absorbed into France and cease to exist as an independent nation. The prince needed to marry and produce children. Why not choose someone who would also save his country's economy? Aristotle Onassis, who was Rainier's friend and business partner, had even suggested Marilyn Monroe. Monroe allegedly told friends she could win the prince over if given 2 days alone with him. But Rainier wasn't interested in Monroe. He wanted someone with class, with elegance, someone who could be a proper princess. The meeting between Grace and Rainier on May 6, 1955 almost didn't happen. There was a power strike in Cannes and Grace couldn't get her hair done professionally. She wore a wrinkle-free floral dress and styled her own damp hair with flowers twisted into it. She was already running late when her escort's car had a minor accident, delaying them further. When Grace finally arrived at the prince's palace, Rainier gave her a personal tour. He showed her the gardens, the throne room, and even his private zoo with its lions, monkeys, and tigers. The visit lasted 45 minutes, and photographers captured the prince and the actress walking together through the palace grounds. Paris Match reported that all that was missing was moonlight. Grace later described Rainier as charming, but she was dating French actor Jean-Pierre Unt at the time, and she left Monaco thinking little more about the prince. Ray, however, was captivated. He began writing to her. Long, passionate letters crossed the Atlantic, Music, from Monaco to whatever film set Grace was working on. They wrote to each other for 8 months, sharing their thoughts, their dreams, their values. In an era before instant communication, their courtship unfolded on paper, allowing them to know each other's minds before they knew each other's daily habits. On Christmas 1955, Prince Rainier traveled to Philadelphia. He asked Grace's parents for her hand in marriage. On January 5, 1956, they announced their engagement to the world. Grace wore a Cartier engagement ring Ray had given her, featuring rubies and diamonds representing Monaco's red and white flag. Later, he'd give her a second ring, a platinum band with a massive emerald-cut diamond that she'd wear in her final film. The press went insane. An American movie star marrying a European prince. It was a real-life fairy tale, the stuff of dreams. But there was a catch. Rainier's family and Monaco's laws required Grace to give up acting entirely. A princess couldn't be a working actress. And there was more. According to some sources, Grace's family had to provide a dowry of $2 million to the House of Grimaldi, essentially buying their daughter's way into European royalty with her entire Hollywood earnings and much of her family's wealth. Grace agreed to all of it, to the money, to giving up her career at 26, to leaving Hollywood behind forever because she wanted out. She wanted to escape the cameras, the scrutiny, the studio system that owned her. She wanted to be more than a beautiful face on a movie screen. She thought marrying a prince would set her free. Instead, it became a different kind of prison. The wedding of the century. April 1956. Grace Kelly left New York aboard the ocean liner SS Constitution with her family, 6 bridesmaids, and 80 pieces of luggage. When the ship arrived in Monaco, 20,000 people were waiting to greet her. Nearly the entire population of the principality had turned out to see their future princess. For 8 days, Monaco celebrated. There were parties, receptions, official ceremonies. The tiny nation was flooded with 1,600 journalists and photographers, more than had covered the entire European theater during World War II. Monaco's laws required 2 ceremonies. So on April 18, 1956, Grace and Rainier were married in a civil ceremony in the Music Palace throne room. 80 guests attended, and during the service the 142 official titles Grace inherited by marriage were formally recited in their feminine forms. But it was the religious ceremony on April 19 that captured the world's imagination. 700 guests filled St. Nicholas Cathedral. Cary Grant was there. Ava Gardner, Aristotle Onassis. European royalty and Hollywood royalty sitting side by side. Outside, crowds lined the streets of Monte Carlo, desperate for a glimpse of the bride. Grace's wedding dress was a masterpiece created by MGM's costume designer Helen Rose as a gift from the studio. It required 25 yards of silk taffeta, 100 yards of silk net, thousands of hand-sewn pearls, and 125-year-old Brussels lace purchased from a museum. The dress had a high neckline, long sleeves, and a train over 3 m long. Grace wore a Juliet cap of lace and pearls instead of a tiara, and she carried a small bouquet of lilies of the valley instead of a traditional bridal bouquet. The ceremony was broadcast live on television to 30 million viewers across 9 European countries. Americans would see it later after the film reels were flown across the Atlantic. It was the first royal wedding ever televised, and it set the template for every royal wedding that would follow. But behind the spectacle, neither Grace nor Rainier was enjoying themselves. Years later, Rainier would admit that the whole thing had been overwhelming, that they'd both wished they could have just run off to a small chapel in the mountains and gotten married there. Grace kept saying the same thing throughout the celebrations. Music, maybe we should just disappear and finish this somewhere quiet. But they couldn't. They were public property now. Grace Kelly had become Her Serene Highness, Princess Grace of Monaco, and the fairy tale had officially begun. Except fairy tales, as Grace would soon discover, often have dark centers. Life in the palace. The early years were the hardest. Grace arrived in Monaco speaking almost no French, the country's official language. The palace was formal, rigid, governed by protocols that stretched back centuries. Rie's mother, Princess Charlotte, had given up her rights to the throne and moved to Paris, but she still wielded influence over palace life and wasn't particularly welcoming to the American actress who'd married her son. Grace was homesick. She missed her family, her friends, the informality of American life. In Monaco, music, everything was structured, ceremonial. She had duties now, endless official engagements, ribbon cutings, music, charity events, all of it conducted in a language she was still learning. The Monégasque people loved her beauty and elegance. But Grace often felt like a beautiful object on display rather than a real person. And she missed acting. God, how she missed it. The craft, the creativity, the challenge of becoming someone else. In 1962, Alfred Hitchcock offered her the lead role in Man. Grace desperately wanted to do it. She began preparing, studying the script, music, imagining herself back on a film set. But when word got out, the reaction in Monaco was swift and brutal. A princess could not be an actress. The palace made it clear the film was unacceptable. Rainier sided with tradition. Grace had to turn Hitchcock down. She would spend the rest of her life wondering what might have been. Every time Hitchcock made a new film with a blonde actress, trying to recreate what he'd had with Grace, she saw what she'd given up. She'd occasionally narrate a documentary or give a poetry reading, but it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But there were joys too. Grace and Rainier had 3 children. Princess Caroline in 1957, Prince Albert in 1958, and Princess Music Stephanie in 1965. Grace threw herself into motherhood with the same dedication she'd brought to acting. She tried to give her children the warmth and affection she sometimes felt was lacking in her own relationship with her father. She also found purpose in charity work. Grace became president of the Monaco Red Cross and used her fame to draw attention to humanitarian causes. In 1964, she founded the Princess Grace Foundation to support local artisans and the arts in Monaco. She established a hospital and a daycare center. She hosted an annual American Week in Monaco, complete with baseball and American Thanksgiving, maintaining her connection to her roots, and she became a fashion icon. Everything Grace wore became news. When she carried a particular Hermes handbag to hide her pregnancy with Caroline from the paparazzi, the bag became so associated with her that Hermes renamed it the Kelly bag. It remains one of the most coveted handbags in the world. From the outside, it looked perfect. The beautiful princess, the devoted mother, the glamorous icon. Magazines ran endless photo spreads of Princess Grace at charity galas with her children on family vacations. The fairy tale was still intact, but behind palace walls, the marriage was complicated. Some close friends insisted Grace and Rainier were deeply in love throughout their 26 years together. Others suggested Rainier could be cold, controlling, that Grace's wings had been clipped more than she'd bargained for. The truth, as always, was probably somewhere in between. They were a couple navigating an impossible situation, a public, music, marriage, lived under constant scrutiny with neither partner able to fully be themselves. By the early 1980s, Grace was in her early 50s. Her children were nearly grown. Caroline was married. Music, Albert was establishing himself. Stephanie, the youngest at 17, was still finding her way. Grace had gained weight and struggled with it publicly, the press noting every pound as though her value as a princess was tied to maintaining her Hollywood figure. She'd started working on small creative projects. She wrote a book about flowers. She and Rainier collaborated on a short film. She was looking for ways to fill her days now that active parenting was winding down. Friends would later say she seemed restless that summer of 1982, as though she was searching for something she couldn't quite name. On September 13, 1982, Grace and Stephanie were at Rock Angel, the family's country home in the mountains above Monaco. They were scheduled to return to Monaco that day. Stephanie was supposed to start school in Paris the next day, and they had train tickets waiting. Grace's chauffeur brought out the car, an 11-year-old Rover, and offered to drive, but there wasn't enough room for 3 people with all of Stephanie's luggage. Grace insisted she could drive. She'd made the trip countless times before. The road was dangerous, full of hairpin turns and steep drops, but it was familiar territory. What no one knew was that Grace had been having headaches. That morning, according to Stephanie, her mother had complained of not feeling well. They set off down the mountain road, mother and daughter, heading home to the palace. It was a route Grace knew by heart. In fact, Music, it was the same winding road where she'd filmed To Catch a Thief with Cary Grant nearly 30 years earlier. They never made it home. The road to Rock Angel. The details of what happened on that mountain road would be disputed for years, complicated by confusion from the palace and contradictory witness accounts. But this much is certain. About 2 miles outside the village of Lurby, on a particularly sharp hairpin turn, Grace's car didn't turn. Stephanie would later describe to her sister Caroline what happened in those final moments. Grace kept saying she couldn't stop the car. The brakes weren't working. She was in a complete panic. Stephanie grabbed for the handbrake and pulled, but it wouldn't stop the car either. The vehicle kept going, picking up speed, heading straight for the barrier that separated the road from the cliff beyond. The car smashed through the barrier and went over the edge. It tumbled 120 foot down the steep mountainside, flipping and rolling until it finally came to rest at the bottom. The first person to reach the wreck found Stephanie pulling herself out through the driver's side door. Not because she'd been driving, but because the passenger side was completely crushed. It was the only way out. Grace was still inside, unconscious. Emergency workers arrived and carefully extracted her from the wreckage. She was rushed to Princess Grace Hospital, the medical center that bore her name. The injuries were catastrophic. Trauma to the brain and chest, a fractured femur, broken ribs, and collarbone. But the doctors quickly realized the worst damage wasn't from the crash. Grace had suffered a stroke. A cerebral hemorrhage, the doctors called it. That's why she lost control of the car. Her brain had been bleeding, causing her to black out just as she navigated one of the most dangerous stretches of road in Monaco. The crash was the result of the stroke, not the cause. But the palace, in its rigid adherence to protocol, began issuing misleading statements. They told the press Grace was stable, that she had some broken bones but was expected to recover. They made it sound like a relatively minor accident. Prince Rainier's own brother-in-law was told his sister was out of danger. Journalists reported that Princess Grace would be fine. It wasn't true. Grace never regained consciousness. 24 hours after the crash, she suffered a second, more massive hemorrhage. The doctors did everything they could, but there was no reasonable chance of recovery. Grace Kelly was brain dead. On September 14, 1982, at 10:55 p.m., the family made the decision to remove life support. Her Serene Highness, Princess Grace of Monaco, died at 52 years old with her husband and children at her bedside. The fairy tale was over. The aftermath. Stephanie survived the crash with a hairline fracture of a vertebrae and a concussion. She spent days in the hospital, recovering physically but devastated emotionally. She had been in the car. She had tried to stop it. She had watched her mother die. And because of the palace's confusing statements and the fact that witnesses saw Stephanie emerge from the driver's side, rumors immediately spread that she had been driving, that somehow the accident was her fault. The rumors were cruel and baseless, but they persisted for years. Stephanie couldn't even attend her mother's funeral on September 18, 1982. She was still in the hospital, still recovering, still processing the trauma. The rest of the family, Prince Rainier and Caroline and Albert, had to say goodbye without her. The funeral was held at the Cathedral of St. Nicholas, the same place where Grace had married Rainier 26 years earlier. Over 400 guests attended. Nancy Reagan represented the United States. Princess Diana came from England. Cary Grant was there devastated. Friends said Grace's death hit Grant harder than the deaths of Alfred Hitchcock, Ingrid Bergman, or even Lord Mountbatten. The service was broadcast to the world. An estimated 100 million people watched as Monaco buried its princess. Prince Rainier, his hair now white, his face aged beyond his 59 years, wept openly. Prince Albert, 24 years old, covered his face during parts of the ceremony. The family was crushed, their grief made worse by having to perform it in front of the entire world. Grace was laid to rest in the Grimaldi family vault in the chapel near the altar where she'd been married. 23 years later, when Rainier died in 2005, he was buried beside her. He never remarried for the rest of his life. Friends said he kept Grace's rooms exactly as she'd left them. The investigation into the crash continued for months. Police examined the car's brakes and found them functioning properly. The theory that brake failure caused the accident was dismissed. Doctors confirmed what Stephanie had said. Grace had been having headaches, had complained of feeling unwell, and had likely, suffered the first small stroke just before losing control of the vehicle. But conspiracy theories flourished anyway. Some claimed the mafia had put a hit on Grace, though no one could explain why. Others suggested she and Stephanie had been arguing that day, possibly about Stephanie's desire to marry her boyfriend, and that Grace had become so upset she lost control of the car. The palace tried to shut down the speculation, but tabloids kept running stories, kept theorizing, kept turning Grace's death into entertainment. For Stephanie, the years after her mother's death were particularly difficult. She struggled with survivor's guilt, with the unfair rumors, with the loss of the person who'd been her anchor. In interviews decades later, she would talk about how angry she'd been, how she'd had to work through a sense of injustice. But eventually, she found a kind of peace. If she'd survived when she should have died too, she decided, then her survival had to mean something. She had to find her place in the world. The legacy. Princess Grace left behind more than just her family and her title. She left a legacy that spans generations. The Princess Grace Foundation continues her work supporting emerging artists in theater, dance, and film, having awarded millions of dollars to hundreds of young artists. Her charitable work in Monaco transformed the principality's cultural landscape. She remains an icon of elegance and grace, her films still watched and studied. The American Film Institute ranked her 13th on their list of the greatest female stars of classic Hollywood cinema. Her performance in Rear Window alone ensures she'll never be forgotten by film lovers. But it's the tragedy of her story that keeps people fascinated more than 40 years after her death. The beautiful actress who seemed to have everything, who walked away from stardom to marry a prince, whose life looked like a fairy tale from the outside, but was so much more complicated underneath. The woman who gave up her dreams for duty and family, music, who never stopped missing what she'd lost, who died on a road featured in one of her most famous films. Grace once said in an interview shortly before she died that she wanted to be remembered as a decent human being and a caring one. She said if her life as a real woman were ever truly told, people would finally discover the real being she was. Not the icon or the princess, but the person beneath. The truth is, we'll never fully know that woman. Grace Kelly lived her entire adult life in the public eye. First as a movie star, then as royalty. Every aspect of her existence was photographed, analyzed, discussed. But the real Grace, the private person with doubts and dreams and disappointments, remained hidden behind the elegant facade she maintained until the very end. What we do know is this. She was brave enough to chase her dreams against her father's wishes, talented enough to win an Oscar at 25, and principled enough to honor her commitments even when they cost her everything she loved about her career. She was a devoted mother, a dedicated philanthropist, and a woman who carried the weight of impossible expectations with remarkable poise. Her children survived her and thrived. Caroline became a respected figure in Monaco's cultural life. Albert became the reigning prince, continuing his father's legacy and honoring his mother's memory. Stephanie, despite her rocky years, found her own path. They are her truest legacy. Three people who knew the real Grace Kelly and loved her not as a princess or a movie star, but as their mother. The road where Grace died has been there for generations, winding through the mountains above Monaco, offering spectacular views of the Mediterranean. It's the same road where Hitchcock filmed her with Cary Grant, where they staged car chases and romantic moments for To Catch a Thief. The irony is impossible to ignore. Grace Kelly's life ended on a road that had been part of her Hollywood dream. A road that represented both her greatest triumph and her greatest loss. Monaco erected a statue of Princess Grace in the rose garden that bears her name. She stands eternally young and beautiful, frozen in time before tragedy struck. It's fitting, perhaps. Grace Kelly never had the chance to grow old, to become a grandmother, to see what her life might have been in its final chapters. She remains in memory and in film forever young, forever beautiful, forever the princess from the fairy tale that ended too soon. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.